In this short video, I'm going to explain basic bookkeeping. I'll go through the concept, I'll then go through 6 common examples. So what is bookkeeping? Bookkeeping is effectively double entry, and the reason why it's called double entry is because there's always 2 sides, a debit and a credit. They always need to be equal, so if I have 1,000 debits, I need 1,000 credits. A debit is shown as a DR and a credit is shown as a CR. Sometimes people show a debit as a positive and a credit as a negative. We are going to talk about 4 elements which make up the basics of bookkeeping. Assets. Assets are what we are owed or what we own. Liabilities. They are what we owe or we owe someone else. Expenses are costs to us, and income is sales and revenue. Debits increase expenses and assets, while credits increase liabilities and income. To decrease these, do the exact opposite. So what is an asset? An asset is cash in the bank, debtors, people who owe us money or unpaid sales invoices, equipment, so computers, cars, tools, property you own. Liabilities are the opposite, so your overdraft when you have a negative bank balance, loans, creditors, people we owe money to or we've not paid the supplier invoices yet. Expenses are rent, utility bills, telephone, gas, materials to make what you sell, salaries, things like that. Income is quite easy, it's cash people give us, this can be on a sales invoice or as a receipt. So these are directly related to each other, so if you increase your income, you're probably going to increase an asset. If you're going to increase an expense, you're probably going to increase a liability. So let's move to some examples. Example 1, we send a sales invoice. So we send a sales invoice for £1,000, we debit our debtors, we increase an asset, and then we credit our income. Later, a customer pays us £1,000 for the invoice, and therefore we have to debit cash, increase an asset, but then decrease debtors and reduce that asset by the same amount. Example 2, someone sends us a purchase invoice. So we receive a purchase invoice for £500, we debit our expense, increasing the expense, £500, we credit our creditors and increase our liability by £500 because we owe them the money. Later you pay the supplier £500 for the invoice, so you have to decrease your creditors with a debit. Then you need to decrease your asset, which is a credit, so we need to credit cash £500. Example 3, we buy a computer. So we receive an invoice for £1,000 for a computer. We need to increase our asset, the computer, by £1,000, but then we owe the supplier money, so we need to increase our creditors by crediting them £1,000. Later, when we pay the supplier £1,000 for the computer, we need to decrease our creditors with a debit, and then decrease an asset, which is our cash, by £1,000. Example 4, we transfer cash from one business account to another. So this is a simple entry, we send £50 to another bank account. You need to firstly increase your asset by debiting bank 1 £50, but then you need to decrease your other bank and credit it £50. Example 5, we submit a tax return. So we submit a tax return to HMRC. We need to debit corporation tax expense, increasing the expense by £1,000, and then we need to increase a creditor, HMRC, by £1,000. Later, when we pay HMRC, we want to decrease our creditors by debiting them £1,000, but also reduce an asset, cash, and credit that £1,000. Example 6, this is the most complex one, and this is for VAT registered companies only. So we send a sales invoice with VAT. When we send the invoice, we need to debit our debtors £1,200, we need to credit our income by £1,000, and we need to credit our VAT liability account by £200. Later the customer pays us £1,200 for the computer, so we need to debit our cash, increasing our asset by £1,200, credit our creditors, reducing our liability by £1,200. Then we pay HMRC the VAT, so we would debit our VAT liability account, decreasing our liability by £200, and then credit our cash, reducing our asset by 200. All these examples are common situations. So if you go back and rewatch this video, you can learn how to do the majority of transactions in your accounting systems. Hopefully watching this video has helped you understand double entry and bookkeeping. If there's any questions you have, please leave them in the comments and I'll reply to them.